Have you ever wondered what a single name can do to the course of history? How the naming of a child might tilt an empire toward the sun? They say he was born beneath a sky heavy with the light of 1,000 offerings. In the deep heart of Thebes, during the late years of Amenhotep III's opulent rule, a son arrived into a world already braided with gold, incense, and rival powers. The city that cradled him, flanked by the great pylons and hypostyle halls of Karnak, by the shimmering colossi that marked his father's labor at the western bank, was a center of ritual authority. Here, the god Amun's priests held sway. Here ritual, image, and politics were woven into one vast fabric. Into that fabric came a child named for the god who dominated it, Amenhotep. Amun is satisfied. Archaeology allows us to glimpse the textures of his infancy. The courts of Malkata, Amenhotep III's palace complex by the Nile, produced pottery and toys. Fragments of game boards and faience animals speak to playful hands. To a prince's small rituals before the larger ceremonies took him. Stone statuary and reliefs of the elder king, the colossal pair we now know as the Colossi of Memnon, would have loomed near the child's earliest memories, their faces turned toward the rising sun, imparting an image of regal permanence that belied the quick turns of courtly life. Yet the story of his birth cannot be told without naming the woman who shaped his earliest days, Queen Tai. She lacked the formal title of great royal wife, in the paternal line of earlier queens, only in name. In practice, she was a force. Surviving portraits, a striking wooden and golden-laid head, believed to represent her, and dolls and statuary found among palace debris, show a woman of unmistakable character. Tai was in correspondence with foreign courts, a political actor. She took part in rituals, and sat beside the king in public functions. For her son, that meant an upbringing suffused with politics, and an intimacy with sacred rites that went beyond mere pageantry. It is no accident that, from his cradle, the prince heard conversations about prophecy, legitimacy, and the fragile architecture of priestly power. The late 18th dynasty was a world of competing centers of gravity. Amun's priesthood at Karnak was rich beyond imagining. Its granaries and treasuries were as much instruments of influence as its temples. At the same time, the visual and ritual language of sun worship, older, more diffuse, present in amulets in the benedictions of village shrines, circulated through the land. In homes and at the river's edge, fishermen and laborers cast glances to the daily ascent and descent of the sun. A boy who grew between the shadowed halls of priesthood and the luminous rituals of the populace might learn to hear the twin voices of orthodoxy and light. We can almost see the small prince learning to hold his first bow, to ride in a chariot along the west bank, to recite the names of gods at the temple's door. There were tutors, scribes, who taught hieratic script, priests who instructed him in the invocations of Amun, artisans who modeled the world to fit the ideals of kingship through clay and pigment. Such training braided competence with spectacle. Every gesture, every utterance in court, rehearsed the place of the king in the cosmos. Yet personal peculiarities can bloom in such an environment. Children raised among excesses sometimes grow into adults who either conform slavishly or break the strictures with startling imagination. Birth dates in this remote age are a fog of regnal years and astronomical correlations. Historians place his arrival roughly mid-14th century BC, a time when Egypt's borders were wide and its diplomacy complex, when vassal letters slid across the Levant and gold flowed into palaces. The material world left by his infancy, tablets, statuettes, fragments of palace walls, is modest but telling. They convey not merely opulence but a court in which ideas moved as readily as goods. Cosmologies could be debated as craft was commissioned. Rituals could be reimagined as readily as a new statue was cast. It is in this cultivated soil beneath the incense, amid the hum of scribe and smith, that the singular figure took root. The boy, named for a god with an entire priesthood at his back, learned early the music of power. Yet around him also circled the sun's simple logic, rising, giving, withdrawing. Something in that daily certainty, mixed with palace ambition and a mother's iron will, would later conspire to alter names, rites, and the very grammar of divinity. For now, though, history records only a child's first cries and a city's watchful lights. The enigma had a beginning that was ordinary and yet, as all beginnings are, pregnant with possibility. A single breath before a kingdom was asked to think of the sun in a new way. Dawn at Thebes arrived like a slow confession. Mists unrolled from the Nile and pooled in the hollows between pylons. The colossal columns of Karnak cut the light into ribs, and the first priests moved like reeds, murmuring as they passed. To strangers it looked like spectacle stone and ritual in perfect choreography, but for the men and women who lived beneath Amun's sway, it was the apparatus of power itself. Theology braided into bureaucracy, worship braided into wealth. Amun began as a whisper from the hills, the hidden one, a local god of Thebes, Weissot, whose name carried a deliberate hush. Over centuries that whisper gathered voices. After the wars that expelled the Hyksos and stitched a new order across the delta, and the southern cities' rulers found in Amun a worthy partner, a god whose hiddenness could be read as mystery, whose authority could be read as supreme. By the new kingdom his persona had fused with Ra, the son of Amarna, father of the gods, universal creator and identity, proclaimed in stone along Karnak's walls and in the mouths of propagandists. You can still read his ascent in the archaeology, the hypostyle hall's forest of papyrus, each column a hymn in granite, the sacred lake where priests purified before entering the sanctuary, the processionways lined with sphinxes where barks bearing Amun's image plied the festivals. Reliefs show his fan-bearers, his plumed headdress. In some depictions he is not depicted at all, his presence implied by an empty shrine, a bark, the ribbon of incense rising toward an invisible throne. Theology and theatre were indistinguishable. But a god must have keepers. The priesthood of Amun became an institution, and institutions accrete power. Temples received land, cattle, and tax exemptions. They held granaries, bakeries, workshops, and treasuries. The precinct of Amun was less a single sanctuary than a city within a city scribe. Houses and managerial offices where lists were kept, contracts written, and the flow of offerings accounted for with ruthless precision. Astraca and administrative graffiti scratched on mudbrick from the Theban necropolis show a world of named functionaries and stores. Rations issued, hands counted, barley measured. The gods ate, the administrators fed an empire. Names float out of that bureaucracy. Hepasinab, high priest under Hatshepsut, built parts of the temple and carried the authority to perform rites that made kings appear as sons of Amun. Uyahu's richly furnished tomb, KV 46, in the Valley of the King's astonished 19th-century explorers, was not merely a beloved courtier. His life hints at the ways non-royal families could entangle themselves in cultic power and royal marriage. Amenhotep, son of Hapu, the sage architect of Amenhotep III, was later venerated as a demigod, an index of how closely piety and politics could bind. The rituals themselves codified allegiance. Each morning a priesthood opened doors to the inner chapel, washed a cult statue, perfumed it, dressed it in finery, laid out on cloths marked with the god's name. The daily aliment of the deity, breads, beer, fragrant oils, was both religious act and economic transaction. Then there were the great festivals. Opet, when the bark of Amun left Karnak to visit Luxor temple and the king processed beside it, and the beautiful festival of the valley, where the living gods joined the dead across the Nile. These spectacles reinforced the illusion that Amun and Pharaoh were partners in the cosmic order embodied by human rule. Yet power breeds friction. As the estates of Amun expanded tax-free holdings that could rival, in some periods, the crown's own resources, tensions crept into courtrooms and shrines. The high priest was not merely a ritualist. He could command labor, invoke wealth, and interpose himself between king and god. Inscriptions and later histories hint at competitive currents, a temple more secure than a king at times, priestly lineages entrenched in Thebes, archives that preserved more than papyri memory and leverage. The archaeology hints at a society confident in its religious architecture, but also at one in which belief was a theater of political claims. Stone hymns chiseled by royal hands proclaimed a deity's supremacy. On Astraca, the humbler scroll of a scribe recorded bread issued to a temple servant. The difference between a prayer and an account was a single line, and the consequences of that line could be empiricized. In that age, then, Amun was no distant star. He was the hub around which statecraft revolved. His hidden face cast a long shadow, a shadow into which kings stepped to be legitimized, priests retreated to grow fat on offerings, and bureaucrats carved their names on envelopes of clay. Whoever would change the axis of Egyptian devotion would have to walk into that shadow and unpick the threads. For now, the old orders held. and Thebes' Karnak as pylons flaring like a crown at the river ruled not merely by sword but by sacrament. He was born into a palace full of gold and the soft thunder of priestly chants, a son whose very given name tied him to one of Egypt's oldest thrones. Amenhotep Amun is satisfied, arrived under the long shadow of his father, Amenhotep IV, whose reign had gilded temples from Thebes to Nubia, and whose queen, Tai, moved through court as counsel and mystery. In those first years the young prince wore the familiar trappings of a royal heir, titulary that invoked Amun, participation in temple rituals, and the carved image that every pharaoh must inherit. Yet, like a sudden eclipse, something in the prince shifted a private conviction that would alter his face in the stone and the very name he bore. We can trace the turning in cold stone and terse hieroglyphs. Official registers reveal a rupture. In the 5th year of his rule, the king who had signed documents as Amenhotep IV scratched a new syllable into the royal roll. The change is not a flourish but a declaration. From Amenhotep, he became Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, some whisper, or more simply servant of the Aten. The name itself is a riddle, a linguistic pivot that slides the focus from Amun, the hidden, to Aten, the visible disk. The evidence lies in the hard record, scarab seals, astraca, and early inscriptions that show the crossing out of one god's name and the emergence of another. At Karnak, and in the mud brick archives later uncovered at Amarna, scribes preserved the deed of that alteration as if it were a legal document in a courtroom of the cosmos. Why did he change his face? Not only did he change his name, the art of his reign began to present him as no prior king had been portrayed. Royal reliefs and painted tombs from what would become the New Horizon show a sovereign stripped of the imperial, idealized corporeality of his ancestors. He appears elongated, with an almost liquid, pliant body, a belly that swells and hips that curve. His features are soft, the cheekbones pronounced, lips full, an image that does not fit the usual catalogue of conquering masculinity. At once intimate and unsettling, these portraits invited the viewer into a court where the divine and the human touched in unexpected ways. Some historians see in these images a political strategy, an intentional blurring of king and god, of mortal and subdisk. Others see a man whose own self-perception, perhaps his health, perhaps his spirituality, demanded new artistic language. Around him moved figures who would shape and reflect that change. Queen Tai, the old lioness of the palace, did not vanish. Her name and likeness remained carved in unexpected prominence, suggesting counsel and continuity amid upheaval. Nefertiti, the bride, whose bust would one day become the emblem of this age, steps into prominence at his side, sometimes holding the royal insignia, sometimes appearing in reliefs as Corrigant, as partner in the strange play of light that was the Aten's court. Yet these faces did not simply mirror his conversion. They refracted it, each depiction a clue to a household in intellectual ferment. The first acts of Amenhotep IV's altered rule were bureaucratic, almost painfully bureaucratic. Hymns recalibrated, temples re-erected, the erasure of a god's name from public space where possible. Inscriptions from the early years show the king ordering new sanctuaries for the sun disk, while seals and letters retained the older titulary for a time, as if habit, protocol, and resistance strained against the invention of a new identity. The archaeological record catches those tensions. Palatial blocks at Thebes still bear traces of Amun's emblems, even as new monuments begin to celebrate the radiance of the Aten. It is the image of a ruler who both inherits a lineage and wills it into a different light. And yet, beneath policy and iconography, there is the intimate human pulse. The prince who changed his face may have been motivated by awe, a sudden certainty in a solitary sunrise, or by reasons less mystical, political calculation against a powerful priesthood, the desire to centralize wealth and worship under the crown, a personal crisis that found expression in a cosmic devotion. The stones do not answer plainly. They leave us the texture of a transformation instead, names crossed out, new epithets carved, a visage recast. In those marks lie a man who reinvented himself, not only in doctrine but on his body and in the public memory. Thus began a reign that would rewrite the grammar of kingship. The change was at once a whisper and a proclamation. The prince had shed a name, and with it, the inherited face of power. What remained was a sovereign who looked like none who came before him, and who would lead his people into a daring experiment in faith and art, a luminous disturbance. recorded by the very stones that would later hide their carvings under dust and silence. They came to a stretch of desert where the river's voice softened, and the limestone cliffs rose like a sleeping congregation of gods. The chosen horizon was not random but a deliberate stage, a narrow plain. The west bank of the Nile cleft by a dry wadi, and backed by a low escarpment whose faces could be cut and carved. Here, where the sun climbed to meet the disk above the eastern plain, Akhenaten ordered a city to be born, not merely a collection of houses and courts, but a visible altar to a single radiant presence. The king rode out with his bark and his court, and the chronicles that Akhenaten himself had set in stone, the boundary stele, tell a dramatized truth, a place seen by the eye of Aten and ordained by the king. These stele, incised deep into the cliff faces, became the legal skeleton of the new town. Their proclamations mapped a sacred geometry, naming streets yet to be built, marking limits beyond which no profane hand might defile the city. They record, in ritual language, the moment the horizon was claimed, an act of foundation as much religious as administrative. From the first day, the work was feverish. Mud brick rose in regimented courses. Timber was scarce, but stone was used where permanence was desired. The most striking innovation of the builders was not the size of their stones, but their modest proportions. Talatat standardized, easily transported blocks assembled with astonishing speed into palatial halls and the vast platforms of the Aten temples. These talatat, like a composer's repeated phrase, allowed rapid construction and later would betray the city's ephemeral triumph when they were pried away and scattered through temples downstream. Akhetaten, as the king named it, the horizon of the Aten laid itself out to honor the daily miracle of sunrise. The principal axis oriented east-west, so that the face of every temple, court and royal window could drink the morning rays. On the eastern plain rose the great Aten temple and the so-called small Aten temple, open to the sky and built around broad altars that received the king's offerings. Their colonnades and broad paved ways were designed less for mystery than for exposure. The sun, not darkness, was the theater, but the city was more than temple. A palace quarter was erected for a pharaoh who wished to be seen as nearer to the light than the other kings. Gardens were planted and fed by a network of channels siphoned from seasonal inundations. A green heart fed by the Nile's whisper. Outside the formal center rows of modest mud brick houses lined streets that climbed towards the western ridge. Behind them lay bakeries, workshops, and the packed rectangular workman's village, where the artisans who forged the new style of art ate, slept, debated, and carved the delicate images of a royalty unbound by convention. The western cliffs were reserved for death made sacred. Tomb chambers were cut into the living rock, small funerary chambers sheltered behind flat faces, their interiors painted with the new visual language. Here the officials and favored nobles who served the Aten and the court were given private thresholds to the horizon doorways facing the light, their walls narrating scenes of the royal family receiving blessing from the sun disk, whose rays end in tiny hands. Above, where the cliffs meet sky, the royal sepulchres were hewn and sealed in secrecy. Their passages led down into a subterranean world intended to receive the king into an intimate solar journey. Nefertiti walked these new streets with the king's entourage, her presence recorded in relief and statuary that would soon define an age. The new city became a stage for unprecedented images, the king at the window raising adoration to Aten, the queen beside him in a partnership lit by the same disk. Officials, too, lived out new identities here. Their tombs and houses revealed names and titles, the administrative machinery needed for a capital grown overnight. Archaeology has since peeled back the fabric of Akhetaten like a partially unstitched garment. 19th and 20th century explorers and later systematic projects have traced the grid of walls and streets, uncovered the rubble of palaces, and read the boundary stele that still speak in Akhenaten's voice. Yet even when modern trowels reveal plan and pavement, the city keeps something of an enigma. Its haste of construction, its bold architectural experiments, and the intimate openness of its temples tell of a singular, urgent project, a city founded not merely to administer a realm, but to remake the very horizon of devotion. To walk Akhetaten in imagination is to witness an act of audacity, kings, laborers, and priests collaborating to put belief into bricks and light into stone. The desert took back the edges, and the sand drifted over streets that once rang with voices. Yet the carved stele remain, stubborn as memory, testifying that a city was born one brilliant morning to catch the sun, and, for a while, to hold the world's gaze. When the horizon first blushed, Akhenaten stepped into a world gilded and naked all at once. No dark shrine, no hidden cult statue, only the broad sky and the great disk that watched from above. The rites he fashioned were not the muffled, incense-choked ceremonies of Karnak. They were spectacles of light, performances where the sun itself reached down with brazen fingers to touch flesh and give life. Archaeology has left these moments as imprints: low stone altars strewn across the courts of the great Aten temple, talatat blocks carved with rays terminating in little hands, and the intimate painted scenes in private tombs that show a king and queen accepting life from a sky that grips human hearts. Dawn and dusk were the bookends of devotion. At sunrise the priests fewer now. Their roles altered, raised bowls of water and libations of beer and wine, and the royal household moved as a single, sacred body. The great hymn to the Aten preserved in the tomb of at Amarna speaks the language of those moments. The sun's rising as a universal gift, creatures waking to drink and eat because the Aten has breathed upon them. It is easy to imagine this hymn being intoned, its lines falling like dew upon clay courtyards as Akhenaten and Nefertiti presented bread, fowl, and fruit on stone tables. Excavations in Amarna reveal such offering tables and the spread of household shrines, small open-air spaces where a family might mirror the royal ritual in miniature. Gesture mattered as much as prayer. Egyptian devotion had long known the prostration forehead to earth, but in Akhenaten's luminous cult a new choreography took hold. Reliefs and boundary stele show the royal couple in repeated poses, arms raised in adoration, palms open to the disk, faces turned upward. The sun's rays, carved in relief, end in tiny hands that hold the ankh, the emblem of life, pressing it to the noses and mouths of the king and queen. To receive the ankh was to draw in life itself, a breath exchanged between deity and sovereign. Such intimate contact left its mark on material culture. Stele at Akhetaten depict the royal daughters reaching for the rays, a family literally kissed by divinity. The priesthood adapted more than it disappeared. Men like Moriah, the high priest whose tomb at Amarna preserved scenes of ceremony, and Penahesi, the powerful chief servitor whose residence abutted the great Aten temple, became administrators of a ritual economy that centered on the palace. Penehos's house, later found in archaeological layers, showing signs of looting and hurried ruin, once stood as testimony to how religious and bureaucratic power intertwined. Unlike the tall hierarchies in the temples of Thebes, priests of the Aten served at open courts, managing offerings and organizing the daily rhythms that turned the city into a perpetual shrine. The rites themselves were simple and public, sweeping away the dust from stone altars, burning frankincense so that smoke braided with sunbeams, presenting carved loaves and bowls of beer, and pouring libations until the stone glistened. The king's hands performed the most sacred gestures. He lifted the ankh, he touched the offerings, he extended the line between human mouth and godly breath. Women of the royal household, Nefertiti most prominently, were not mere bystanders. She appears repeatedly in reliefs, making offerings, inclining toward the Aten, a co-priest, in an unprecedented duet, their daughters, to kneel and receive the sun's hands. Family was theology made visible. No image of the Aten was hidden in a dark sanctum. Instead, the god's presence was both ubiquitous and elusive, a disk or a bald, bright god without form, recognizable only by the ankh-tipped rays that consummated union with the royal person. The absence of cult statues meant that ritual could not rely on tactile contact with a carved god. It demanded performance under the empty sky, and in that demand lay both power and vulnerability. The boundary stele that ringed Akhetaten record foundation ceremonies and vows, public proclamations that anchored a fleeting devotion to the permanence of stone. Yet the ritual itself was ephemeral, obedient to the rising and the falling of light. There were processions but they were processions of day. Priests and officials bearing standards and offerings out across the city to large sun courts where commoners, who had hitherto seen divine favor through intermediate priests, now glimpsed the royal couple as the sole intercessors. To see Akhenaten appear upon a balcony, to receive an ankh as the sun's tiny hands descended, was to witness theology made human. In this daily theater the lines blurred, ruler and ritual became inseparable. The palace, an altar, the progeny of the king and queen moving through choreographies that were at once civic and sacred. Archaeologists have scraped away the sands and found the ashes of incense, the bases of open altars, and the painted gestures of a people devoting themselves to a light. The rites of the Aten were at once a religion of visibility and an enigma. Everyone could watch, yet the god remained only a disk and a promise, a solar hand that offered life and required a gaze turned perpetually upward. Thus the day was measured not by clocks but by worship, and the city of light hummed with the pulse of a ritual that both dazzled and unsettled, an experiment in how a people might live beneath a single sun. They painted him like a prophecy caught in color, not the carved certainty of a conquering god, but a living body stretched and softened until it might be mistaken for a dream. In the bright precincts of the new city, the sculptors and painters who answered to the command of the king let the old rules slip like a shroud. The canonical fist, the rigid stride, the idealized nose and chin, the pharaonic lexicon that had spoken for centuries, was set aside. What rose in its place was a new grammar, long sinuous limbs, hips and bellies that curved as if to hold a world within, faces that were blunt and tender lips, full as if always on the verge of speech. Archaeology gives us rooms full of evidence for that breath. In the ruined studio of a master craftsman at Amarna, archaeologists found a broken limestone bust that would later become the world-famous face of Nefertiti, the elegant work attributed to a sculptor named Thutmose. Discovered in 1912 by Ludwig Borchardt, the bust came from the workshop complex where plaster models and sketchings remained frozen in their making, a snapshot of creative intent. Nearby, plaster fragments, tool marks and discarded talatat blocks tell of fevered hands reshaping an iconography sanctioned from above. The house of the Aten, the palaces, the private tombs of officials like Maria show the same hand, compositions alive with domestic scenes, private moments lit by the unmistakable fingered rays of the sun disk. It is in those tombs that the rhetoric of kingship dissolves into human intimacy. The breath of the state and the intimacy of the household are all one continuous light. Around them their daughters play. Delicate names, Akhetaten, Akhetaten, are carved and painted beside their small bodies. A god's presence does not remove the domestic, it sanctifies it. This new visual register also rewrote masculinity. The pharaoh, while retaining regalia that declared his sovereignty, the double crown, the crook and flail in some contexts, is often rendered with breasts, narrow shoulders, and a pendulous belly. The deliberate androgyny of many images has been read and rewritten by scholars for a century. Some see theological symbolism, a visual metaphor for the life-giving Aten, encompassing male and female. Others propose physical conditions that might explain unique physiognomy. The archaeological record refuses to settle the argument. The evidence is crafted, staged, and meant to be seen. It is equally political and intimate. Perhaps the safest wonder is that the king permitted, even directed, his likeness to unsettle ancient viewers as much as modern ones. The art of Amarna is also tactile evidence of a king who sought to make himself known in a new tongue. Reliefs are shallow, lines flowing like ink. Paint, ochre, lapis, lazuli blue, malachite green, remains in surprising vibrancy when not stripped by time. Colossal stone fragments from the great Aten temple and scattered statues show elongated proportions, scaled to intimidate yet to beckon. Small statuettes, block statues and stelae were not mere decoration but a daily liturgy in pigment and stone, theology made visible and memory inscribed into the everyday. Yet even as the imagery is revolutionary, it is coded. The Aten esrays often end in tiny hands, instruments of blessing that bypassed priestly mediation and descended to touch the royal family directly. Their choice marks a political alignment, an adoption of a visual theology that substituted domestic transparency for temple pageantry. The untamed kingship is thus both an intimate portrait and a public manifesto. What remains when paint flakes off and eyes weather out of stone is a body of work that refuses to be comfortable. Akhenaten's images ask questions rather than issue commands. They invite us into a court where kingship is soft rather than iron, where power is exercised in touch and exposure rather than in an unassailable mask. Listen then to the murmured winds that once crossed the Levant and found their way into clay. The court of Akhenaten was not a hermit-esque cave, but a crossroads of thunder and entreaty. From the sunlit horizon of his new capital came a steady drip of messages, clay tablets impressed in the dead language of Akkad, diplomatic smoke signals that skittered like sand across sea and plain. The archive at Amarna, a trove of roughly 380 such letters, is our lantern into those stormy years. Kings and mayors writing with equal desperation to the man whose face the sun had reshaped. These are not mere formalities, they are lives under pressure. Rib-Hadda of Gubla, the lord of Byblus, sends one pleading after another, his voice ragged with fear as rival city-states and mountain chieftains gnaw at his shores. The enemies have looted my town, he cries. He begs the king for archers, for gold, for the thread that ties a vassal to his sovereign. Across the same seas, Biridia of Megiddo records battles that creak like oars in the dark. Abdi-Habia of Jerusalem, whose name is like a small lamp, writes of brigands and the Apiru, a shifting, shadowy force that devours stability and spits out exiles. To the north, the storms are not only metaphor, a new power. The hurled will of the Hittites under the house of Suppiluliuma presses down from Anatolia. In the letters, this pressure becomes personified in the name Ozero, the ambitious ruler of Amun. Ozero's correspondence is a drama of duplicity. He writes as one who honors Egypt, yet behind the script he courts Hatti and packs his loyalties like traded horses. His negotiations and eventual defection read like the turning of a stormfront, a localized tempest that grows into a regional gale. Ambassadors move between courts. Promises are given and delayed. The brotherhood of great kings frays at the edges. Even great partners Tushratta of Metaneskrub, their royal flourishes into plaintive petitions. Tushratta's letters to Egypt sparkle with courtly rhetoric and shipments of fine horses and gleaming lapis, yet they also bear the weight of a strange intimacy. He addresses Akhenaten not only as sovereign but as fellow keeper of treaties sealed in marriage. His complaints about dowries and statues, his insistence that ancient pacts be honored, show diplomacy as both commerce and conjuration. Great kings exchanged daughters and idols like talismans. When those talismans were late or slighted, the fragile lattice of peace trembled. And then there is Babylon. Berna Beriash writes, with the bluntness of a neighbor worried by neglect. These great powers, Mitanni, Babylonia, Hatti, Egypt, speak in the same Akkadian tongue across empires, and their messengers carry crates of gold, ritual objects, and sometimes only the empty gesture of friendship. For Akhenaten, who redirected the kingdom's zeal inward to an alabaster sun god, these outward courtesies sometimes felt enough. Gifts were sent, words returned, but the hard instruments of empire, archers, garrisons, rapid interventions, came less readily. To client kings who wanted shields rather than silver, the response could seem like a divine silence. The clay speaks most of all in human detail. Seals pressed into wet tablets, the irregular hand of a provincial scribe, the tiny corrections of a panicked mayor. The letters reveal a bureaucracy, still capable of grand ceremonial, but strained where force was required. Foreign potentates test the limits of that strain. When Aziru lingers in Hatti or Rib-Hadda is abandoned to his enemies, the consequences are not only political but visceral. Cities change names, temples fall silent, corpses fill campfires. So the northern storms did not merely test Akhenaten's armies, they tested his priorities. The Amarna letters are the thunderclap that reveals what lay beneath his sunlit doctrine. The world beyond the Nile demanded a steady hand as much as a new theology. In the hush after each dispatch we hear a double truth, that kingship is both radiance and responsibility, and that even a ruler who claimed a private conversation with the sun could not entirely keep the winds of war and ambition at bay. The tablets remain, mute and cracked, like the secret correspondence of a sleeping god, whispering of favors asked, favors withheld, and a fragile international order buffeted by the first great storms of a new age. Listen, beneath the gilded solar beams that Akhenaten commanded, another darkness worked more quietly, not the absence of light, but a slow, patient artistry of preservation and revenge. The priests of Amun were not only priests, they were landlords, tax collectors, archivists, and power brokers, whose holdings spread from the granaries and reed beds of the Nile to the stately colonnades of Karnak. Their wealth was written into the land itself, fields, cattle, workshops and fleets that supplied a state more complex than any one throne. When a king dared to unname those gods, he did not merely silence statues, he severed livelihoods, erased legal claims, and endangered an entire political class. Karnak, the great settlement of Amun, in Thebes, is our first witness. Its pylons and hypostyles, even today, show scars of a period when the name of Amun was gouged, recarved, and sometimes left as a ghost of letters. Archaeologists have mapped the ebb of temple income during the Amarna years. Holdings listed in temple archives thin noticeably, and the once busy workshops recorded in the papyri and astraca of Deir el-Medina lie strangely quiet or redirected toward the new capital. Those household lists and complaint notes, the brittle voices of workmen and wives, speak of delayed rations and broken routines. Bread and beer, the staff of life and of ritual, were redirected. In such unglamorous shortages, grievance seeds itself. What was betrayal if not waiting for the rightful moment? The priesthood dispersed rather than dissolved. Some priests fled to the silent aisles of provincial shrines. Others kept the old rites alive in private chapels. In the tombs of nobles who still insisted on reciting spells to Amen in the face of royal indifference, Theban tombs like that of the vizier Ramos TT 55 captured the uneasy overlap. Walls painted with the crisp new style of the Aten, alongside traditional scenes as if the hand that held a chisel could not decide which god to bless. Those painted faces stare at us now like witnesses who did their best to conceal their choosing until the time came to speak. Power moves in coalitions. The high corridors of the palace kept their own shadows. I, who styled himself God's father, and Horemheb, commander of the army, names that later stagger across the historical record like anchors dragging a net. Neither wore the mitre of Amun, but both were men with clients among Thebes' elite and with reasons to prefer stability. Scholars debate how much the priesthood directly conspired with such courtiers. The evidence is indirect, but persuasive. When the state's fiscal arteries were redirected to Akhetaten, influential men at court lost more than favoritism. They lost patronage networks. To reconstruct those networks, to restore the flows of grain and favor, required agreements reached in rooms not recorded on stelae. We can imagine the gestures. A whispered counsel to a military commander about the unreliability of a king who refused to attend the Nile festivals. A secret petition copied on a papyrus and passed to a vizier. The careful protection of temple lists and deeds hidden in cellars and sacred caches, while clerks gave court accountants a different account. There is archaeological residue for such clandestine economies. Palimpsest lists, administrative records erased and rewritten, and later reappearances of temple landholdings as if they had never been touched. These are not the acts of a throned populace, but of a bureaucratic class that knew precisely how to make the state tolerate its return. Betrayal, too, wore a ceremonial face. To withhold a right to let the sacred statue lie unadorned on its shrine for a single day was to threaten the cosmic order. But the priests had learned a harsher lesson. Ritual interruption was also leverage. By subtly altering the narrative of the divine favor, by sustaining cultic memory in secret, they kept alive a counter-history. When the court's patience with Akhenaten began to thin, when the kingdom's political center felt an ache it could not ignore, that counter-history had ready instruments, men like I who could step into vacuums, and generals like Horemheb who could restore order with swords in hand and priests at their side. We will never hold in our hands a minute sheet of their midnight meetings. What survives is the residue in stone and in silence. The chiseled blows that later removed Aten's name from monuments, the hurried recarving of Amun's titles back into pylons, and the bureaucratic restoration of temple estates. These are signatures left by those who had waited out an eccentric king and then reclaimed Egypt's old scaffolding. In the end, the priests were not merely defenders of ritual. They were custodians of power, who understood that religion could be both altar and instrument. So the betrayal was neither simple devotion nor raw treachery, but a long administrative undoing, a patient counter-kingdom run by the keepers of memory. In the dim rooms behind Karnak's great walls, in the silent registers of Deir el-Medina, the ghostly hand of a restored order wrote itself back into being, and the stinking S-light, brilliant though it had been, became a candle snuffed at the threshold of institutional night. Listen then, to the rasp of wind over baked mud brick, and the hush of cliffs that watched a city rise and fall like a mirage. There, where the Nile's light trembled, the servants and scribes of Akhenaten carved for themselves a last testament into living stone, not pyramids of old, but intimate sunlit tombs cut into the desert face where dust keeps secrets and paint still remembers fingers. These are rock-cut sanctuaries, chambers gouged beneath the cliffs that ringed Akhetaten. Their courtyards once opened two chapels of baked brick. Their shafts dropped into cool, dark rooms, a mixture of hurried design and deliberate devotion. On their walls the Aten reached, painted in rays that end in tiny hands. On their lintels the king's cartouche glows. The clear story of images is a daily liturgy. Nobles kneel, attendants receive collars, children gamble with uncanny intimacy. The art here is not funerary formalism, but a private hymn to sunlight. A new visual grammar that flattened distance between monarch and subject. Where elsewhere kings are aloof in stone, here the royal mother Tai receives gifts. The pharaoh's family bends and laughs beneath the sun. Among these names are Penehasi, Perenefer, Huya, Mariah and Mahu, men of power whose tombs betray not arrogance but proximity to the changed court. Penehasi, once a favorite, shows us a household and rituals that belonged to a vanished day. Huya's chapel preserves a meticulous world of gifts and inventories tied to Queen Tai. Maria's rock-cut room records audiences and epiphanies, his offerings to the Aten staged, with a serenity that feels rehearsed and sudden. Mahu's scenes arrest the hand of law in motion, a commander of order in a city where the old order was being remade. The archaeology here is as revealing as any oracle. Excavators arriving in the modern age found a palimpsest, vivid pigments flaked into powders, plaster with underdrawings, and trial sketches where artists fastened life to the wall with charcoal lines. Norman de Garris Davies and his contemporaries set their brushes to copy scenes that would otherwise vanish. Later, Barry Kemp's Amarna project peeled back layers of abandonment and reused to show how these tombs were left mid-stint. In many chambers the work stops, faces blank under an unfinished cartouche, the master's chisel abandoned. These arrested images speak of a sudden exit, a relocation of cult and capital that left both palace and necropolis half-made. Grave goods rarely lay undisturbed. Tomb robbing had its long arc in Egypt, and at Amarna, the defacement that followed the city's fall is as informative as it is violent. Names were excised, iconography scraped away. The rays of the Aten hacked off in the hands of ideologues who rewrote the sky. Yet in niches and burial pits fragments persisted. Beads of faience, copper blades, pottery stamped with workmen's seals, ostraca, shards of limestone bearing sketches, accounts, and the scratchings of anonymous hands, littered workmen's debris, supplying a chorus of ordinary voices. They tell of payments, of bread issued to laborers, of the banal ledgering, of a revolution of faith. Beyond the cliff-faced tombs, common cemeteries whisper other stories. Here lay artisans and families, humbler interments of decayed textiles, masons' tools, and plain pots. In these graves, the Amarna aesthetic persists in miniature, amulets with Aten motifs, children buried with small models, the vernacular presence of a theology that reached beyond palaces. Archaeology uncovered also hurried pits, where bones were gathered and reburied, the practical aftermath of upheaval, and a few chamber burials that reveal reuse in later periods. The site is a cemetery of layers, each burial an interlocutor with time. And then there is silence. In a few tombs the original coloration survives, so that under torchlight one can almost feel the sun's warmth that the ancients sought. Elsewhere, graffiti and chiseling are the language of condemnation, cartouches erased, royal faces smudged, as if to unname the monarch from the land. Yet, paradoxically, these attempts at obliteration preserved the message. The very strikings make the original clearer, exposing the points of conflict between memory and history. so the cliffs keep their tales. Archaeology at Amarna does not only reveal objects, it reconstructs daily devotion, the intimacy of a mother's lap, a steward's reward, a child's play, and the violence that erased names. In the dust of these tombs is the tune of a court that sang to a single sun, leaving behind chambers like frozen verses. Listen close. The plastered walls breathe with half-finished prayers, and the nobles' burials murmur of an epoch that dared to reframe divinity, and then, as suddenly, dissolved into sand. They opened a little door in the rock, and found a mirror of a ruined age, a cramped chamber, strewn with objects like the afterthoughts of a hurried funeral. It was January 1907. The man who thrust a trowel into that dark pocket of the Valley of the Kings was Edward R. Aten, working for Theodore M. Davis. What Akhetaten and his crew unearthed would become one of archaeology's most stubborn riddles, a jumble of gilded fragments, a mask dulled by time, a coffin not quite right for the body it held, and at the center of it all, a single set of bones. The tomb, catalogued as KV55, was the sort of space that makes historians whisper. Objects lay as if plucked from different tables of a royal banquet and cast together. A gilded anthropoid coffin whose gilding echoed the late Amarna style, a finely beaten gold mask that wore the softened features so characteristic of that court, portions of a shrine, and a scatter of amulets and pottery. Names and cartouches had been hacked away, titles erased. The crowding, the damage, the strange mixture of high-quality royal workmanship with crude makeshift repairs, all spoke of emergency, of haste, of a court in flight, and a ritual undone. At the center of the tomb's drama was the occupant. The coffin had been fashioned, and at some time adapted, for someone of royal rank. But when its lid was lifted, the mummy within was a man, not a queen. Here was a royal bone, the skeleton of an adult male, wrapped and left, as if to answer no longer to a name. That anonymity would haunt Egyptology for decades. From the beginning, the objects pulled the tomb backward into the last flickers of the Amarna revolution. Many of the pieces bore stylistic echoes and inscriptions tied to the Aten period. Others bore the hand of Amenhotep III's workshops. The mixture suggested a time of violent reversal, when the sun god Aten rose with Akhenaten, and then, like a comet, was chased away. Officials, scrambling to protect or conceal former kings, had moved things. Priests, in the counter-reformation that followed, struck out names. KV55 looked less like a planned royal resting place and more like a temporary repository for a disordered past. Who, then, was the man in the coffin? Early commentators proposed names with the force of longing. Akhenaten, the eccentric sun king who had appended tradition. Smenkhare, the shadowy short-lived ruler who may have succeeded or quarreled with him. Osteologists measured the bones and read a contradictory language. Some early examinations suggested a man no older than his 30s. Others, when new techniques and fresh eyes arrived, posited a man in middle age. The biology of bone refused to yield a tidy verdict. Age at death estimates varied with method, and each estimate shifted the possibilities of identity. The 20th and 21st centuries brought radiographs, CT scans, and, crucible-like, genetic testing. In 2010, a high-profile genetic study, announced by Zahi Hawass and colleagues, argued that the KV55 skeleton was the father of Tutankhamun and the son of Amenhotep III, a genealogy that fit Akhenaten neatly. The report ignited both hope and skepticism. Critics pointed to the dangers of degraded DNA, contamination, and the perils of overinterpreting familial matches across generations of royal intermarriage. Radiological re-examinations continued to split opinion. Some teams arguing an age at death that matched Akhenaten's chronology, others insisting the bones were older, perhaps pointing to a different claimant. Beyond the bones and the lab reports, the tomb itself remains eloquent in its silences. The deliberate erasure of names, the oddly reworked coffin, the presence of items associated with both Amenhotep III's majesty and the Amarna aesthetic, all suggest a narrative of hurried concealment and later desecration. Someone sought to protect, someone else sought to unname. The man in the box is thus doubly robbed of identity in life by the politics of the court and of certainty in death by the long hands of history. KV55 is a small chamber that contains a great suspense. Its artifacts are fingerprints on a period that tried to reinvent the divine. Its bones are a last, stubborn human trace. Modern science has scoured marrow and mineral, unwrapped bandages in pixels and gel, yet the tomb refuses to tell a single, clean story. It gives hints, familial ties, stylistic echoes, signs of violence against inscriptions, and then slips back into shadow. In that dim little room the past seems to make a defiant boast, even when names are hacked away, and cartouches are gouged from stone. A royal bone can still speak, if only in riddles. The voice is uncertain, the grammar broken, but it insists on being heard. And so the skeleton in KV 55 remains the most intimate witness to the last days of an experiment. In kingship, its silence a summons, its fragments a song that scholars still strain to complete. Listen then, to a tale told in stone and shadow, where gods put on masks and a single king dared to hold the mirror up to divinity. In the great riverine theatre of Egypt, two faces of the sacred stared at one another across centuries. Amen, the hidden lord of Karnak, and the Aten, a disk of burning light raised on Akhenaten's altars. Between them stood the pharaoh, once the living Horus, later transformed in word and image into the only mouthpiece for a single son. Amun was the old power, cloaked in mystery and multiplied in temples. Walk the ruined avenues of Karnak, and you can still feel the press of devotion that made the god both distant and intimate. His name, the Hidden One, granted priests an authority born of secrecy. Stone lists and temple records show how vast estates and granaries were appended to Amun's house. Taxes flowed into his precincts, and the high priests became stewards of economy and memory. Amun could be kingmaker without lifting a sword. His rites and oracles threaded through the politics of Thebes like roots under the sand. The Aten, however, refused the mitted shadows. The disk of the sun, simple and absolute, burned across palace walls at Akhetaten, in broad open spaces. Archaeology at the city of the horizon, the remains of courtyards, open chapels, and the long lines of talatat blocks, confirms a ritual world staged beneath the sky itself, where Amun required sanctuaries that masked the divine in inner rooms and dark sancta. The Aten required no inner sanctum. He was visible, audible, and immediate. Reliefs and the famous hymn that reverberates from the walls of an Amarna tomb, the great hymn to the Aten preserved in the tomb of I, sing of the sun as the sole giver of life, bestowing breath and growth upon all creatures. The language is startlingly universal. The Aten shapes the Nile's flood, arranges the seasons, feeds both man and beast. Unlike the anthropomorphic gods of the older pantheon, this deity is cosmic function made holy, and the king, no longer merely a god among gods, he became the necessary hinge. In titles that replaced Amenhotep's, in the new royal epithets inscribed across Amarna's boundary stele, the ruler cast himself not as a priest among many, but as the unique mediator. The reliefs make the argument clearer than any royal decree. The rays of the Aten reach down, each ending in a tiny hand offering the ankh to the king and his family. Only the royal house receives the ankh-writhed life directly. In the counterpoint of images and text, Akhenaten is both beloved son and solitary mouthpiece. He speaks for the visible sun, interprets its will, and alone communicates its blessing to the realm. This was not merely liturgical rearrangement but a reconfiguration of power. Amun's veiled priesthood depended upon secrecy, sanctuaries, and the accrued wealth of temple endowments. The Aten's cult, as archaeologists have inferred from the layout of Amarna's religious complexes and the stark absence of a traditional priestly class in official inscriptions, inverted that model. Rituals were performed in the open, offerings were public. The pharaoh was the ritual node. Theological language followed, whereas Amun's myths indulged plurality and hiddenness. Atenic texts emphasize unity and transparency, yet the faith was curiously personal. The great hymn's warmth toward creation sits uneasily beside the political monopoly implied by closed royal access. Compare the two, and a paradox emerges. Amun is intimacy through mediation, a god who shelters and multiplies his images and his agents. The Aten is exposure, the light that reveals, undresses, and thus centralizes sanctity in a single human intermediary. This is why later Egyptians could not easily fold Akhenaten's revolution back into the older order. The pharaoh's claim to be ontologically necessary for communion with the divine threatened the very social contracts that temples had woven into everyday life. Archaeology keeps whispering evidence, defaced Amun names carved away from walls, talatat blocks shipped like choral verses from Amarna into the stonework of Karnak. open-air altars lying where once only shadows fell. Yet the Aten left no priestly lineage to inherit his theology. When stone and official memory were overturned after Akhenaten's death, the old mirrors were restored. Still, in the clear light of the sun disk's hymn, and in the audacity of a single king who cast himself as sole interlocutor, we glimpse a theological experiment like no other, a moment when kingship, divinity, and the nature of worship were all refracted through one eternal flame. The cliff above Akhetaten hollows like a mouth, waiting for the sun's descent, and in that carved throat the royal dead were meant to make their last slow voyage. The tombs cut into the eastern escarpment at Amarna rock-hewn corridors that turn, like secret rivers, are not merely houses of stone but stage sets for a new drama of death. Here, where the rays of the Aten themselves are painted reaching into rooms, the familiar ancient script of judgment and Osirian rebirth yields to images never before staged on so public a scale. A sun disk with arms, a hand at the end of each ray, bestowing life directly upon the living and the dead. Archaeology gives us the bones of this strange liturgy. The so-called royal tombs at Amarna are arranged with a peculiar intimacy. The corridors lead to chapels and small side cells, chambers intended not for grand Osirian ceremonies, but for the bodies of a dispersed royal household, daughters, consorts, perhaps a hastily intended place for the king himself. Painted reliefs inside these rooms are dominated by one motif, repeated with obsessive tenderness. The Aten's rays pierce the stone's interior, each tipped with an ankh offered to the nose of the king or queen. The funerary ritual is thus rewritten as a direct, tactile bestowal of breath of life by sunlight itself. This is not to say tradition vanished overnight. Mummification continued in practice. Coffins and canopic equipment appear in the record, albeit often simpler. Sometimes crude evidence that the upheaval at the top did not erase all memory of rituals that stretched back centuries. Yet the words once chanted over the dead, the litany of Osiris, the spells of the Book of the Dead, are conspicuously scarce in the Amarna corpus. In their place are hymns to solar presence, the great hymn to the Aten, found inscribed in palaces and possibly intended to shape the soul's final words. Its lines imagine the Aten as the sole visible god, scattering life across the earth, a creator whose daily journey is both the source of being and the path the soul may follow. How then did Akhenaten imagine the journey beyond the western horizon? The traditional Egyptian voyager, nocturnal bark of the sun, a passage through Duat, the weighing of the heart before Osiris, was a rich tapestry of mythic stages. At Amarna, the tapestry frays edges and new threads appear. The Aten's journey is visible and cyclical. The disk rises, warms, withdraws. Its rays touch life and withdraw. The afterlife in this frame is less a courtly trial and more a continuing reception of the Aten's gift. To be favored by the Aten was, perhaps, to be remembered and sustained in the light. Scenes on tomb walls emphasize the warmth of family life. The king cradled by sunlight, suggesting that the ideal afterlife was a prolongation of this sunlit intimacy rather than a courtly transformation into an Osirian state. The fate of Akhenaten himself is the greatest lacuna. His intended sepulchre in the cliffs was left incomplete. Some chambers show hurried work, suggestions of plans abandoned as the world turned elsewhere. Later disturbances and the political retribution that followed Amarna's decline make the king's final resting place one of Egyptology's most haunting puzzles. Bones recovered centuries after, such as the controversial remains from the tomb identified in the Valley of the Kings as KV 55, have been thrust into the center of debates. Are these the bones of the heretic king, a later sacrificial pawn, or someone else entirely? Scientific analyses offer tantalizing clues but no settled verdict, and every new test only deepens the mystery. Nor did the afterlife Akhenaten envisioned remain undisturbed by history. Within a generation, the old names were chiseled back into the corpus of ritual. The Nile of memory rolled over the sand-scoured city and erased many inscriptions. Yet the echo remained. Objects from the Amarna period were found in later tombs, reworked and repurposed, as if the beliefs of one age had been folded, not fully destroyed, into the wardrobes of another. Tutankhamun's burial, which contains relics hinting at Amarna's brief court, is a silent testimony to that complicated inheritance. So the passage to the sun becomes not merely a ritualistic itinerary, but a question. Did Akhenaten's dead join the Aten in a peaceful expansion of light, or were they cast out of the old order to wander? The stones at Amarna offer no straightforward answer. They give us instead a new image of dying the last breath, gifted by an offering hand on a sunbeam, an image that insists the soul's final movement may be simpler and stranger than the long corridors of judgment. And as dusk falls on the cliff face, the painted rays still point westward, as if waiting for a return that may never be documented, but is forever promised in the warmth of a hand-shaped light. Listen, the wind still remembers how a city once glowed like a peeled orange under the Nile sun, and how quickly that glow was snuffed. What followed was not a single thunderbolt of punishment, but a slow, meticulous undoing, a campaign of memory against a king who had dared to rewrite the names of gods. When the lights went down in Akhetaten, they did so for reasons both prosaic and sacred. The priests of Amun, whose coffers and power had been hollowed by the Aten's rise, did not return merely as avengers. They returned as custodians of an older architecture of loyalty. In the hush of the years after Akhenaten's disappearance, while his sun-disk still cast shadows on half-finished paintings, the old establishments reassembled. The temple economy reasserted itself. Land and manpower flowed back into the precincts of Karnak and the great temples of Thebes, and a king whose name still bore the suffix Aten became a liability. The most visible evidence of that reversal is carved not in triumphant new monuments, but in erasure. At Amarna, the faces were struck through with cold steel. Aten's rays hacked from walls, cartouches abraded, until only the ghost of a name remained. Archaeologists find Talatat blocks, those small, portable limestone slabs used by Akhenaten's builders, scattered like intellectual scatterings of a burned library. They did not rot where they fell. They were hauled away and reassembled into other walls. Look at Karnak and Luxor today, and you will find these palimpsests, Atenic scenes jammed into the core of later pylons, their sun-disks hidden, their cartouches overlain or smashed. Men who wished to forget had chosen the pragmatic route of reuse. It is a deliberate, amnesia-made architecture. The first hesitant pivot was political. Tutankhaten, no longer Aten, accepted Amun back into his name as Tutankhamun, and with that simple shift worked a powerful spell. His decree of restoration, issued in his early reign and echoed in monuments and stelae, sought to mend temples, to reopen sanctuaries, to re-establish cultic revenues. It reads like a treaty of return. Artisans summoned to repair. Festivals reinstated. Images reinstated. Yet even as Tutankhamun sought reconciliation, his court bore the telltale fingerprints of the old and the new. Advisors like I and the General Horemheb would soon steer the ship through sterner waters. A's brief rule filled the vacuum, but did not end the drift toward reaction. Horemheb, once a feline of the army, and later a pharaoh in his own right, did the heavy erasing. His campaigns were administrative as much as iconoclastic. He restored the legal and fiscal networks that sustained the theocratic order, purged those who could not be trusted, and ordered the obliteration of what he called the innovations. Horemheb's hand reaches into the archaeological record in two ways, through what he destroyed and through the stones he left building anew. Under his orders, cartouches were chiseled from stupas and royal lists. Amarna's memory was pushed off the map, quietly, bureaucratically, permanently. But destruction always leaves traces of intent. Excavators at Amarna unearthed ovens with bread still cooling, pots still in the act of cooling, abandoned stables, and tools lying where their owners had fled. There are Astrock-inked jottings on pottery jagged with the suddenness of a life interrupted. In the temples of Thebes, inscriptions show new allocations of fields and cattle to priests of Amun, accounting entries meant to refill treasuries emptied of their dues. The political calculus is clear. To restore Amun was to restore the fiscal heart of Egypt. Yet do not confine this to arid administration. Iconoclasm is also theology. The Aten, once sung as a universal giver of life, was systematically reduced to an embarrassment. Reliefs were not only erased. Where they could not be removed, they were recarved faces reworked into other figures, scenes reinterpreted. Later pharaohs, especially the Ramesside kings, codified the erasure. King lists carved in stone from Seti I onward pointedly omitted the Amarna line. In the liturgy and in the ledger both, Akhenaten's revolution became a forbidden stanza. And so the city that had been bright faded into a ruin that later kings harvested to bolster their own monuments. Stones moved, names erased, temples refilled. The great undoing was a work of both politics and memory craft. But even as the priests rebuilt the old order, The very act of obliteration preserved a secret. You cannot utterly burn what the sun itself once touched. The palimpsest remained, and with it the question that haunts kings and scribes alike. Was the restoration an act of salvation, of revenge, or of frightened pragmatism? In the dust of Amarna one hears, still, the faint echo of a sung dissenters' single voice that dared to address the divine alone, and for that daring was both celebrated and extirpated. The priests reassembled the columns, the generals reassembled the state, and the people folded their festivals back into older names. Yet the stones that once bore a different gospel were never quite made to disappear. They survive as riddles for a future that will one day read the erasures and ask why a civilization would so meticulously unmake its own experiment with the sun. They could not kill what the sun had named. They could only, with hammers and blunt will, try to erase a face. What followed Akhenaten's brief and luminous reign was not a simple revenge. It was a long campaign of forgetting, a careful re-editing of Egypt. This official story so that the memory of the heretic would become a ghostly smudge between the lines of kings who came after him. The first editors were immediate and intimate. Tutankhaten became Tutankhamun in the first breath of restoration. His own change of name, a public stroke of emendation, the Aten erased. The old household god Amen restored to the front of the stage. Tutankhamun's restoration stela set down in stone near the start of his reign announces the reopening of sanctuaries, the return of cult images to their places, the healing of cities that had been neglected. It was an official imprimatur. Religion was to be rewritten back into its ancient grammar. But state religion is architecture, and architecture is durable. The temples, colonnades, and small talatat blocks, those standardized, portable limestone bricks used at Akhetaten to build shrines to the Aten, became raw material for later builders. When the Theban crowns rose again, those talatat were carried by cartloads from the abandoned city and put to new use as masonry, hidden as fill and foundation, or incorporated into the walls of Karnak and Luxor. Centuries later, when archaeologists began to puzzle them out, these scattered, repurposed pieces became a mosaic of what the reformers had once built. The work of erasure, then, produced its own accidental archive, the palimpsest of stone. More deliberate cuts were visible to any eye. The name of Akhenaten was chiseled from Stelaean statues. Faces were smashed, noses and lips removed so the king's effigy would not be recognized. On many Amarna reliefs, the royal cartouche is a blank, a shameful absence where the god-king's titulary had been. In some instances, sculptors turned the old clay into new loyalty. Shoulders and torsos were recarved to show different rulers. The same block read now as propaganda for a successor. The work was not always tidy. The strikes were brutal, the lines of transition abrupt. It was a censorship practiced in stone. The selective amnesia reached also into official lists of kings. The Abydos king list, carved under Seti I, is a lesson in deliberate genealogy, a tapestry of predecessors chosen to legitimate the present, with entire episodes pruned away. The Amarna rulers Akhenaten Smenkhkare, parts of the short, troubled liner absent, invisible in a papyrus-like band of palace memory. Ramesside, king lists, and temple inscriptions follow similar editorial choices, arranging history to remove the anomalous chapter, yet erasure always leaves traces. Tombs were reopened, objects repurposed, mummies moved and rewrapped when the politics of memory shifted. The royal burials and the curious reals, later discovered and mislaid by history, testify to conflicting intentions. Piety, fear, opportunism. Bones and coffins tell of hurried relocations and uncertain custodianship. Later hands cut and wrote over earlier names on funerary equipment. The very attempt to hide produced a palimpsest of funerary texts and human remains, an archaeological tangle that centuries have had to read like a layered, burned manuscript. The priesthood, too, were authors in this remaking. Amun's priests regained wealth and power, and with it, the right to shape public understanding. Temple walls were redrawn. Hymns to the Aten were shelved, even as their phrases haunted tomb poetry. Scribes and priests, writing liturgies and royal encomia, chose what to preserve and what must be spoken of only in whispers. Over generations, the tenor of the story hardened into moral judgments. Akhenaten as madman, as monotheistic zealot, as one who had inverted Ma. In funerary chapels and state archives the language hardened. Where once innovation might be described as piety, later rhetoric would call it desecration. and yet the erasures were not absolute. In hidden storerooms, in the curious corner of a temple, reused as a quarry, in the recycled talatat, embedded in the foundations of the great Theban sanctuaries, fragments endured. Much later, the scholars of a modern age would peel those layers back, like a reader recovering a palimpsest, and find not only the defacings, but the music beneath. The hymns, the sun litanies, the uncompromising image of a pharaoh who had dared to recast the heavens. In the end, the story of Akhenaten's memory is not a neat erasure, but a layered manuscript. Each generation wrote upon, cut away, and sometimes smoothed over the lines. What later Egypt sought to do, transforming a living king into an absent stain, was to prove the power of collective storytelling. Yet that same force that obliterated also preserved, in the gaps. In reused stones, in altered cartouches, the original voice whispers still, awaiting a patient ear to join the fragments into a whole. Listen then, and bend your ear to the desert wind, for it carries a name that would not die. A king who wagered his soul against 1,000 statues, and though his monuments were smashed, and his priests scattered like chaff, the strange light he once named the Aten persisted not as a pharaoh's shadow cast upon stone, but as an idea that haunted later ages. When the dust settled over Akhetaten, and the old temples of Thebes reassembled their altars, the memory of Amenhotep IV, Akhenaten, was not simply buried, it was carved out. Names were chiseled away, reliefs hammered into blankness, and annals written to make the past conform to the restored order. Yet silence breeds curiosity. In the centuries that followed, scribes and priests told new stories of a reckless king who struck at the heart of Mat, a heretic who misplaced the gods. Over time, rumors swelled into myth. Coptic tales, medieval scribes, and later Hellenic commentators remembered a time of upheaval. But their voices were sketchy fragments, echoing through a maze of intentional forgetfulness. The modern resurrection of Akhenaten came not by oracle, but through patient archaeology and the stubborn sleuthing of letters. The clay tablets of the Amarna archive revealed a diplomatic world from Ugarit to Babylon, placing Akhenaten within the broad network of late Bronze Age rulers. The hymn carved in an Amarna tomb, the sublime great hymn to the Aten, spoke with a tone disarmingly familiar. Praise for the sun as creator, provider, and singular source of life. When Jean-François Champollion unlocked the language of the hieroglyphs in the early 19th century, the hymn became available to the modern mind, and readers could no longer dismiss the king's theology as mere palace eccentricity. Scholars and poets have long stood at the crossroads of fascination and caution. To some, Akhenaten is an unambiguous precursor of monotheism, a monarch who elevated one divine principle above many, restructured worship, and demanded intimate, almost personal devotion to light. To others, the resemblance is oblique, a royal theology inseparable from kingship rather than a universal creed. The Aten spoke through the pharaoh. Worship was centered on his person. Unlike later monotheisms that proposed ethical commandments transmitted to communities, Atenism's surviving traces emphasize royal liturgy and the visible radiance of the sun disk rays ending in touching hands. Speculation can be viable in the 20th century. Sigmund Freud dared in Moses and Monotheism to draw a line from Akhenaten to Moses and thence to Judaism, a provocative hypothesis that fed both scholarly debate and popular lore. Freud's theory married fragments of history to psychoanalytic imagination, exile, religious reform, a lost prophet carrying a sun-born revelation into the hills. Yet the evidence remains slender. The Amarna letters do testify to a world porous with movement. Canaanite cities communicated with Egypt, but no decisive text binds Akhenaten's Aten directly to the Hebrew god. The more cautious chorus of historians places the king in his own epical singularity, a bold experiment, not a blueprint. Akhenaten's afterlife has been eclectic. He became a muse for romantics and novelists, a figure for the ages in 19th century Egyptomania. When excavators like Flinders Petrie first surveyed Tel El Amarna's ruins and Victorian eyes hungrily read ancient walls for lost revelations, in the academies, Barry Kemp's Amarna project and subsequent excavations transformed speculation into archaeology, cataloguing boundary stele, house plans, and the daily traces of a city built for a sun cult. In modern spirituality and popular culture, Akhenaten's image is co-opted anew by occultists, by artists, by novelists who find in his life the lonely purity of a prophet out of time. The mystery that clings to him is not merely the silence of broken tombs, but the persistence of an idea that refuses to perish. Monotheism did not spring fully formed from the Aten, yet the notion of a single, overwhelming source of life, articulated so vividly in a desert palace, resurfaced across millennia, in ways both convergent and divergent, whether as a shadow that touched other faiths, or as a solitary flare in Egypt's long religious tapestry. Akhenaten achieved a strange kind of immortality. So the story closes not with bones or bricks, but with light. The pharaoh who named the sun's disk left behind a hymn and a city, and a scandal that centuries could not forget. Archaeologists keep finding his fingerprints in clay and stone. Historians keep arguing over the meaning. Poets keep singing the tragedy. And somewhere in the places where history and imagination meet, the Aten's rays still reach out, elusive, accusing, tender, inviting us to ask again what it means to worship one luminous thing and to make of light a god.